I think magic definitely exists in this world. The world is filled to the brim with magic, and maybe I prefer the inexplicable over that which can be explained. That's the true nature of football. A single goal sends the crowd into a frenzy and induces a pleasure that blows away everyone's sanity. Footballers are magicians, and one day I'll become someone who can cast a spell on the entire world. These words form the backdrop against which the entire PXG match is framed. From the perspective of Alexis Ness, football is a breathtaking sensation, an otherworldly escape from our mundane reality. Yet, as the PXG match progresses, Blue Lock's magician finds himself increasingly abandoned and isolated on a team that advances with frigid logic and scientific rigor. It scores goals by manipulating the minutiae of classical mechanics. Its star players suppress their personal emotions and become machines for the sake of victory. They learn to classify the inner machinations of everyone's psyche into distinct categories with scientific precision. And even the infinitesimally complex process of evolution gets reduced to a mathematical formula. This is the tension that runs through the entire PXG match. On the one hand, we're shown time and again how rationalistic deliberation trumps reliance on base instincts, and yet the same match sees each of Blue Lock's greatest strikers evolve by aligning themselves more closely with the arbitrary, irrational desires at the heart of their ego. And within this tension is found the key to becoming nothing less than the world's best striker. Hello, my name is Sean, and please sit back because I genuinely believe that this is the best Blue Lock video I've ever written. Also, if you like what I do and want to support the channel and help me fund custom artwork, do consider joining my Patreon. My patrons also get access to my weekly podcast with my first thoughts on the new Blue Lock chapters. The finale of the Aniel, just like the two matches that came before it, begins with a flashback that serves to set up one of its major character arcs, but also its overarching thematic concerns. And so, let's have a look at the message that's communicated by this particular flashback. Alexis Ness is a natural romantic who was born into a family of scientists, and his parents and siblings vehemently reject his fantasies. Yet, what's important in this flashback is that Alexis is ultimately validated by the narrative. When he declares that he'll become a professional footballer, his family callously dismisses this seemingly impossible aspiration. Soon enough, however, they're proven completely wrong. Alexis encounters in Michael Kaiser someone who recognizes his exceptional abilities and helps him actualize them, and together they make their way onto a professional team. In other words, the very people who lay claim to the ability to clarify and interpret the inexplicable are revealed to hold a deeply myopic view of the world, and their hypothesis is unequivocally refuted by the boy who wholeheartedly embraces the supernatural. Also, just to point this out, yes, the meeting between Ness and Kaiser is absolutely intended to be the match's prototypical example of a talented learner extolling the virtues of a misunderstood genius to the world. Second observation. The scientism of the Ness family is especially remarkable in light of the fact that Alexis plays for Bastard München, the team of extreme rationality that places zero stock in anything that can't be substantiated by hard data and impeccable reasoning. In particular, there's a striking parallel between Noah and Alexis's father rejecting the invisible To put it differently, we're meant to understand that Alexis ended up in an environment that offers an eerie resemblance to his family home, the place that invalidated everything he stands for. As such, it should be no surprise that the downfall of Ness throughout the PXG match takes place against the backdrop of his team finally actualizing the full potential of their latent rationality. So let's talk about the first moment in the match where Ness clearly fell short of Kaiser's expectations, the Magnus shot. Kaiser's new spin on his signature technique, pun very much intended, is probably the most overtly scientific weapon in the entire series, with its successful execution relying on hitting the ball with pinpoint accuracy at the center of the airstream. And more than that, accomplishing the shot during actual play requires a highly specialized pass that accounts for the intricacies of fluid dynamics. In short, it's no wonder that Ness fails to meet Kaiser's expectations. After all, Kaiser is effectively asking his magician to do science. A bit further in the match, Ness's character is used as a foil for Bastard München's rationality more generally. At the stage where every other player contributes to the team's ruthlessly rational brand of destruction, Ness alone proves unable to slot in with the greater whole. There's a very interesting parallel here in the original Japanese that gets lost in translation. When Isagi asks Ness to become a pawn for their victory, the Japanese couples katakana reading koma, which is a game piece in shogi, with the kanji for dogu, tool. By the way, if you're interested in the intricacies of these types of linguistic games, I'd highly recommend checking out my recent video on stuff that gets lost in translation. In any case, there is only one other instance in the entire manga where koma gets glossed with kanji for dogu. At the end of the Manshine match, where Isagi apologizes for using Yukimiya as a pawn in his power struggle against Kaiser. Now, there's a lot to unpack with this. On one level, this callback showcases how both Isagi and Yukimiya have grown over the course of the NEL. The team as a whole has matured from its petty power struggles to working together for a shared purpose. That idea is further reinforced by the fact that the scene with Ness takes place in the very same chapter where Isagi and Yukimiya acknowledge how their rivalry elevates each of their plays, which is the effective consolidation of their development during the Manshine match. In fact, the pass to Ness came about from the loose ball following Yukimiya's blocked shot, and Yukimiya recognizes his former self in the Ness who fails to connect with the rest of the team. Moreover, in the latter parts of the PXG match, referring to oneself as a tool or a pawn signifies the pinnacle of rationality as manifested in the philosophy of victory above all else. It's worth noting here as well that the Japanese term koma refers to any game piece, and thereby suggests less of an asymmetrical power dynamic than pawn does in English. In other words, when Isagi asks Ness to become another player on the figurative game board, it's not an attempt to subordinate Ness to his own narrative like in Manshine, but rather an invitation to partake in his and Kaiser's newfound rationality. And Ness's ultimate failure to join in demarcates his inability to operate by the ordinances of reason. But taking a step back, there's definitely a thick layer of irony in how Ness's preoccupation with the fantastical facilitates his gradual descent into madness. One of the most significant takeaways from Ness's character arc is that fully aligning himself with the magical cuts both ways. On the one hand, this powerful guiding drive undeniably allowed him to attain the skills and success that he showcases since the start of the arc. And yet, it's also entirely due to this all-encompassing desire to believe in things that don't exist that he proved so highly susceptible to Kaiser's manipulation. Even despite witnessing countless instances where his deluded idealization of Kaiser stands in direct opposition to what transpires in objective reality, Ness doesn't falter in his loyalty. As is directly acknowledged at the tail end of the match, the wizard was effectively the only one who was bewitched all along. I realize I've been going on about Ness for quite a while now, but I hope that all this has made it clear that the PXG match is deeply concerned with the tension and interplay between magic and logic, the rational and the irrational, and the impact of both on one's success on the pitch. Let me give you another example of a character who is used to explore these issues in the PXG match, and also against a markedly scientific backdrop: Rensuke Kunigami. Now, just to address some comments that I'm almost certain to get, given the general dissatisfaction with his role in the PXG match and the NEL as a whole, I fully agree that Blue Lock under-delivered on the narrative promises it made with his return at the start of the NEL, and that his impact on the arc was somewhat underwhelming. However, that in no way precludes his character from holding deep thematic significance to the PXG match, much of which is, in my view, overlooked in the general fanbase. For that, we need to go back to an association that was set up in the symbolic juxtaposition between the two masters in the Barca match, where Lavinio's inexhaustive font of creativity is figurized by his dance of death. Noah's rationalistic football gets likened to a machine, devoid of art or life. Lavinio also constantly dubs him a cyborg, an entity on the boundary between man and machine, the perfect embodiment of scientific football. Now, this association isn't too strange on its own, but what's significant here is how this imagery ties into the overall concerns of the PXG match. As the arc progresses, we actually see Kunigami being referenced to as Blue Lock's cyborg, as a means to highlight his current status as a bona fide copy of the world's greatest striker. And on a similar note, the scene right before the start of the PXG match has Ego order Kunigami to abandon his ego altogether, to become selfless, a cog in the machine, right as he steps out from a sort of test tube. This association between Kunigami and machines was already anticipated in the Manshine match, however. Have a look at how Isagi reflects on the repercussions of using metavision for the first time. His body is drained because any machine will break if you run it on full power forever. This remark gets even more interesting when we situate this moment in its full context though. It transpires right after Kunigami turned Isagi's bungled shots into a proper goal, which leads to a confrontation between the two players who are most explicitly set up as Noah's potential successors. Kunigami here chastises Isagi for failing to live up to the ideal that is Noah, with the underlying implication that he is the real deal. In his view, he's an optimal goal machine, in contrast to the player who broke his own machinery and doesn't even have anything to show for it. That brings us to the PXG match, where Kunigami at last sheds his cyborg persona. Instead of suppressing his desires like Ego ordered, his enmity towards Shidou actually fueled him to perform at the peak of his abilities, and causes his ego to flare up once more. And considering the importance of origins throughout the match, it's highly significant that Kunigami's greatest contribution in the match is demarcated by him returning to his original philosophy. To make sense of this, I need to return to two crucial character moments from earlier in the story. Way back in the first selection, Isagi's pass allowed Kunigami to score Team Z's very first goal. That moment leads to a scene where Kunigami brings his guiding philosophy that he'll always fight fair and square into practice, by sharing half of his stake, half the reward for his goal, with Isagi. Now, flash forward to the Barca match, which concludes in the exact same manner as the opening match of Blue Lock's first selection, with Isagi assisting Kunigami to score the final goal of the match. This time around, however, Kunigami doesn't show his teammates any heartfelt appreciation, but rather rebukes him for his shortcomings as a striker. Yet, one element does jump out here. Kunigami demands an explanation, because Isagi doesn't owe him anything. In other words, even post-Wildcard, he still views the world in terms of fairness and reciprocity, albeit in a more transactional way. That brings us back to the PXG match, where Isagi rekindles Kunigami's ego, his core values, by evoking their bonding moment from all those chapters ago. Just look at Kunigami's eyes opening up when Isagi references the symbol of everything he stands for. That leads him to make an assist that represents him making good on the debt he accrued back in the Barca match, fair and square once more. So in brief, Kunigami's return to his origins is strongly intertwined with him giving in to his emotions and subjective values in place of this machine-like selfishness that Ego had imposed on him. Now, the reason why I'm going into such detail on all this is that Kunigami's return to his origins offers a striking juxtaposition to some of the central events at the end of the match. On the most basic level, Isagi's own return to his origins comes about from a diametrically opposite development. It's the result of him letting go of, rather than embracing, his subjective fixations on other players and abandoning his ego for a greater purpose. And let me hone in on one detail in particular. Once Isagi and Kaiser embrace this contractual rationality, they repeatedly take over the machine imagery from Kunigami as the true embodiments of BM's philosophy. And note how this coincides with the scene where Isagi finally positions himself on the same ground as Noah and challenges his idol on Noah's own terms. In other words, Isagi becomes a machine both because he has now fully subscribed to Bastard München's brand of rationality, and because this allows him to genuinely vie for Noah's status as the world's best striker. The wildcard survivor, on the other hand, never gets dubbed a cyborg again after his moment of awakening. In fact, Kunigami even acknowledges Isagi as an egoist machine as he scores the winning goal. It's clear now that even Kunigami relinquishes this title to the player who has effectively become Noah's prime successor. I also want to touch on one other notable parallel between Kunigami's and Isagi's awakenings in the PXG match, and that's the lens of transactionality. As I already noted, Kunigami post-Wildcard frames his dynamics with Isagi in terms of debts, where coexisting with his teammates is a matter of balancing the books fairly. And from that, it's interesting how similar this is to how Isagi frames his proposal to Kaiser. They enter into a contract, one with clearly delineated terms and conditions. Now, why is this the case? Over the course of the NEL, we've seen how Bastard's three main strikers irrationally sabotage their teammates. And that's not just the case for Isagi and Kaiser, but also for Kunigami. So basically, one of the major questions of the NEL is how to get these three egoist strikers to cooperate and embody BM's guiding philosophy. And as it turns out, the eventual solution arises exactly from this very guiding philosophy. The team's most fractured actors don't come together because of emotions like trust or goodwill, but through adherence to objective rules, informed by contracts and quasi-legal obligations. To put it differently, the moment that Kunigami starts functioning as part of the team is demarcated by him settling his outstanding debts, and thereby entering into the social contract that underpins the team. Now, I've touched on a lot of elements related to Kunigami's role in the PXG match, but let me piece together all these observations and appreciate how layered this has gotten. Noah's moniker of cyborg was originally attributed to Kunigami because he is the closest physical approximation of the world's best striker. But then he lost this status because he gave in to his emotions. In contrast to Isagi, who reconstructs himself into a machine in Noah's image. Yet it's exactly by tapping into these irrational tendencies that Kunigami could be incorporated into the rationalistic fabric that is Bastard München. One that doesn't revolve around simply pursuing your own desires, but about operating within a set of clearly defined roles and obligations. So in other words, it's exactly by acting less like Noah that Kunigami finally embodies Noah's values, in contrast to how Noah chastised his antics at the start of the arc. I'm highly aware that I've probably gone on for about 20 minutes by now about the PXG match without actually touching on PXG itself, so let me use this as a bit of a segue. Throughout the NEL, we've become accustomed to the idea that each team represents a unique philosophy. For PXG, however, their underlying values are a lot less clearly defined than those of their peers. And Julien Loki is also unique among the master strikers in that he never explicitly articulates the underlying philosophy that informs his decision-making. But while the PXG approach is never directly linked to a singular concept like rationality, creativity, or tactics, the French team offers a very deliberate contrast to further explore what Isagi and his teammates actually represent. Let's start with my earlier observation that BM only becomes a unified system after its leading figures have established rules and order. However, there's a very specific sequence of events that leads to Isagi and Kaiser signing their Devil's Contract. Following Rin's goal, and I'll have a lot more to say on Rin in a minute, the field is completely dominated by him and Loki, two freaks of nature with physical talents beyond anything that Bastard München can measure up against. And right when he completely shuts down our protagonist, France's master low-key articulates the closest thing we've gotten to his worldview so far. The slow ones die first. That's just a law of nature. In other words, this is a team that adheres to the law of the jungle, one where only the most extraordinary individuals rise to the top and everyone else gets culled off. And at its helm stands the world's most celebrated up-and-coming striker, an illogical aberration with completely incomprehensible levels of speed. And so, when Loki brings PXG to the absolute pinnacle of its performance, they subject Isagi to a natural selection of sorts. One where he finds himself woefully unprepared to fend off individuals that are undeniably genetically superior to himself. Here's another small example of how PXG is effectively the team of nature. At the start of the match, Nichiro Nanase begs Rin to help him survive the cutthroat environment that is the Neo Egoist League. Rin then offers him prototypically PXG style guidance. He identifies a latent physical talent in Nanasei's natural ambidexterity. Nanasei simply never noticed because he's been shackled by the confines of our dextronormative society. Unite, fellow left-handers. But his time at PXG transformed even one of Blue Lock's weakest links into a bona fide freak of nature. Yet, the clearest example of PXG as the team of nature are its two strikers, Ryusei Shidou and Rin Itoshi. It's no coincidence that these two spearhead the French team, and that's not just because they are deemed Blue Lock's two greatest strikers. I'd say that the choice for Shidou is relatively straightforward here. Blue Lock's number 2 has long been established as a player who operates on instinct alone and sees football as an expression of pure life energy, free from the confines of societal norms. And let's not forget that Shidou is the one who sees scoring goals as a reproductive activity of sorts. To put it simply, there's no player better suited for the ruthless survival of the fittest represented by PXG than someone whose every move is fueled by a desire to perpetuate his own genetic material. That brings us to Rin. For that, I just want to quickly establish a baseline against which we must understand his developments in the NEL. At the end of the U20 match, Rin makes his first attempt to step out of Sai's shadow and become his own person, manifested in his persona as Blue Lock's egotistic destroyer. However, at the very end of the match, Rin relapsed into his old habit of seeking his brother's approval, a telltale sign that he's still not quite overcome Sai's formative influence on him. So, if Rin's developments in the U20 match revolve around rejecting what he's not and dismantling the ties that restrain him, the PXG match sees him rediscover himself as his own person and gradually reconstruct himself in his new image. This is why the PXG match gives us the Rin flashback from before the Rin flashback, one that harkens back to the time before he'd even started playing football. Like in a few other Blue Lock backstories, the point of visiting Rin's early childhood is to showcase his true nature, from before he got warped by the norms and values of those around him. This contrast between nature and culture is one of the series' core juxtapositions, with the first selection literally revolving around undoing the Blue Lock candidates' cultural assumptions and rebuilding them from zero as egoists. And now, in PXG, Rin finally undergoes the exact same development. He's returned to his stage without any learned behaviours, unrestrained by the expectations of society. So, let me put all this differently. Why is Rin in particular the main antagonist from the PXG side? It's because PXG is the team of nature, of survival of the fittest, and this is best embodied by its star striker, whose arc revolves around rejecting his assumed place in society. And over the course of the match, he forgoes all semblance of humanity and surrenders himself to his feral instincts. That brings me to the factor that actually unites Rin and Shidou in the PXG match: the pursuit of pleasure. The idea of PXG as this primal entity is underscored by the way both of its main strikers subject themselves to their base instincts, their desires for food, and especially sex. This characteristic of the French team is established as early as the first goal of the match. It's not the result of any predetermined strategy, but comes forth from a collision of Charles and Shidou's selfish pursuit of their ultimate pleasure. This desire is taken even further with Charles' awakening that leads to Rin's goal. By making a pass that both of them can reach, he effectively reduces Rin and Shidou to a pair of starving beasts, savagely competing to satiate their animalistic urges. And it's in these circumstances that Rin can finally unleash his suppressed desires, fully abandon his humanity, and come into his own as the ultimate monster. And with his crash-out goal, Rin's mind is blown by a violent, explosive pleasure like nothing he's ever experienced. Note also how both Charles and Shidou only acknowledge Rin after he abandons his sanity and fully obeys his monstrous impulses. This is what eventually allows PXG to come together as a team. In place of clashes between the puppet master and the demon, we get two forces of nature that link up to satisfy their hedonistic cravings. By the way, this aspect of PXG was flagged even before the match commenced. Loki finds himself inspired by the perverted Bastard München lineup with its two competing systems, and responds in kind with a perverted system of his own. Also, just as an aside, I can't help but love the cheeky foreshadowing of Shidou likening this setup to a kaiju battle royale, given that this very formation will facilitate Rin's transformation into the ultimate kaiju. In any case, Loki sure wasn't kidding when he said that he'd unleash his team's inner freak. Following Rin's awakening, virtually every move he makes is cast in terms of sexual pleasure. When Charles uses Shidou as bait and passes to Rin instead, this is framed as the two aces cuckolding each other. Isagi then repeatedly designates Rin as a freak and asks him if it felt good when he finally shuts him down. The sexual undertones of this scene are even more overt in the original Japanese, where he actually calls Rin a hentai, a pervert. Kaiser similarly shuts down Rin because his pleasure points are too obvious. Then, realizing that he's become predictable, Rin concludes that he must seek out an even more pleasurable source of destruction, which is exactly what he achieves a chapter later. He experiences his ultimate pleasure by destroying Isagi's connection with Kaiser. Meanwhile, Shidou is also being Shidou. In short, all the innuendo throughout the match serves as a shorthand to epitomize what PXG represents. At its core, the team is a den of ravenous beasts that stop at nothing to satiate their carnal desires. So, I've made a whole argument about Rin's arc in the match effectively revolving around him abandoning his humanity. And if at any point a light bulb lit up in your head and went, hey wait, that's kind of like this other character in the PXG match, well done. You're a very clever girl, boy, or anything in between. Feel free to leave a comment to affirm that the contents of your cranium are exceptionally sophisticated. The first major flashback during the match sheds light on Michael Kaiser's dark history of childhood abuse, and how his warped nature arose from his unresolved trauma. At the very heart of Michael's complex stands the lesson that his father beat into him, that he's a piece of filth, lower than a beast, not a human being. And even after he was freed from this abusive environment, he still held on to this misguided belief. As Kaiser went on to distinguish himself on the pitch, however, he discovered a way to imbue himself with a sense of humanity. By eroding the hearts of others and harvesting their despair, just as how his father had maintained a semblance of humanity by lording over someone weaker than himself. As Kaiser's reign over the German team slips out of his grasp, however, he becomes terrified at the prospect that he'll also lose his status as a human being in the process. After all, his only perceived claim to humanity rests on his impact on the pitch. Yet, as he processes his fall from grace, he also realizes that he'll never affirm his existence any further if he simply fights to retain his current position. And so he finds himself with no choice but to shed off everything he'd obtained, including his acquired status as a human being, and return to his place of zero, back when he wasn't considered human. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence at all that Isagi's two major antagonists both come to occupy the twilight zone of humanity as the match progresses. In fact, a scene towards its end heavily suggests that one's status as a human is very much a contested issue in this match. As Rin seeks out a means to counter the Isagi-Kaiser duo, he evolves into a life form beyond recognition, an 11th hour mutation that might transcend even the status of monster, and warp him into an unfathomable eldritch horror. Yet, when this terrifying entity charges head-on towards Kaiser, the German superstar manages to counter and deflect the attack. The reason for this? Because he's a piece of shit who endured a childhood that no human being could ever imagine. With a single shot, he dissolves Rin's illusion, which by the way offers a full circle moment to the scene where Isagi dissipated Sai's spectre. So what's effectively at stake in this interaction is the question of what constitutes human nature, and which of them can actually lay claim to humanity by this point in the match. I think it's now time to address the elephant in the room which already reared its head a few times. Looming behind most everything I've touched on so far is the theory of evolution. And now I want to set out my own theory of everything to examine why the entire PXG match revolves around this singular core concept. Just to take a step back though, we need to acknowledge that Blue Lock, since its earliest conception, has always oscillated between narrative and metaphor. It's both a story about football and a story that uses football as a vehicle to critique Japanese society and make claims about the inner workings of the human psyche. And that is something Blue Lock's author Muneyuki Kaneshiro has explicitly acknowledged on multiple occasions. However, this element of the manga has never been made more explicit than when Ego sets out his theory of evolution in chapter 281. So let me start by unpacking the underlying premise of Ego's speech. Ego's theory basically rests on a three-layered analogy. The first layer is the biological process of evolution, where genetic mutations in organisms get passed down and gradually give rise to new species. From here, Ego posits an analogy between the workings of evolution in the natural world and the way changes occur in human societies. At times, a certain individual introduces hitherto unfamiliar ideas that completely revolutionize our culture, as if they're injecting new genes into the gene pool. And just to make it perfectly clear, human innovation isn't literally evolution. After all, evolution in its scientific meaning specifically refers to the way changes emerge in the genetic composition of organisms. All Ego is doing is anchoring his ideas about how societal transformations arise in a more familiar concept. This leads us to the second analogy, the claim that rapid improvements of footballers arise through the same dynamics as socio-cultural innovations of the level of entire societies. Now, I know that it might seem like I'm needlessly overcomplicating all this, but the notion that these three domains, nature, society, and football, are deeply interconnected is critical to understanding the central conceits of the PXG match, as well as its implications for this story as a whole. Notably, this threefold analogy is not limited to Ego's speech. It's sustained throughout the entire match, especially in its latter stages. In particular, look at the way the events on the pitch are repeatedly couched in the language of evolution. The difference between Isagi and the geniuses goes down all the way to the level of genetics. Cullen players who can't keep up is like natural selection. Ness failing to become one with his teammates is like a cancer cell that destroys its entire organism. And, as I've already touched on, Loki explicitly evokes the laws of nature where the strong devour the weak when PXG starts dominating the match. But to understand the full narrative significance of Ego's theory of evolution, I want to point out a further fundamental assumption that Blue Lock's mastermind makes here. To start with, each of his three manifestations of evolution represents continual progress. Organisms gradually become more sophisticated and capable of surviving. The arts and sciences are fonts of revolution and innovation within society. And clashes between world-class footballers drive them to reach unprecedented heights. But more than that, the way Ego structures his theory strongly implies a gradual progression between these three layers, with each subsequent level constituting a major advancement over what came before. The struggle for survival between savage beasts is superseded by the advent of civilization, with culture and technology paving the way for humanity to reign supreme over the natural world. And there, at the pinnacle of all mortal endeavors, stands football, the greatest manifestation of the human spirit. I also can't believe I just said that. God, this story is so dumb. Okay, I know I put this in a way that makes it sound silly, but that is kind of the underlying premise of Blue Lock, right? It's a story about how Japan is held back on the global stage by its collectivist culture, and becoming the greatest egoist striker is a way to not just surpass the constraints of Japanese society, but also to create a genuine athletic revolution. And this is why, especially from the U20 match onwards, the manga places such great emphasis on the emergence of a hero. The world's best striker that the Blue Lock project aims to create is basically a superhuman entity that represents the next stage on this evolutionary ladder. Now, by this point, I want to flag that some of this, in my view, does get uncomfortably close to ideas that have left behind a deeply sinister legacy. In particular, Ego's ideas about this type of evolution towards a higher stage definitely reminds me of the Nietzschean Übermensch, a concept that is undeniably tainted given its adoption by fascist ideologues. Furthermore, the talk about culling the weak and incapable as a form of natural selection calls to mind the pseudo-scientific concept of social Darwinism that was used as a justification for genocide and dehumanization of ethnic minorities all over the world, including Japan, Germany, and the United States. That's not to say that I see Blue Lock as fascist propaganda or believe that Muneyuki Kaneshiro himself holds fascist views. I generally advocate for approaching works of art in good faith, and I hope that it's clear from this video that I hold Blue Lock in very high regard. Nevertheless, I'm also a big believer in reflecting critically on the media we consume. I recommend that every Blue Lock fan checks out Explanation Point's video on the fascist undertones of Blue Lock. I'll also leave some further resources in the description if you want to learn more about the history of the ideas I've just described. So okay, back to the video. While I know that the PXG match is far from the only part of the series that alludes to the concept of heroism, it holds a particular structural significance as the finale of the NEL. For one, the arc literally begins with Isagi making his choice for Germany in order to follow in his hero's footsteps. And so, it's fitting that the climax of the arc then sees the birth of a new egoist hero, one that the entire world is anxiously awaiting. With all this in mind, let me once more pose a question I've already somewhat touched on. Why are Rin and Kaiser in particular the two main antagonists of the PXG match? In short, it's because both of them in a way represent a kind of evolutionary regression. Their major awakenings in the match don't see them transcend from human to superhuman, but rather discard their humanity altogether. So basically, they're more than just rivals for Isagi to surpass on his journey to become the world's best striker. In the symbolic fabric of the PXG match, their developments pose an existential threat to the very aims of the Blue Lock program. One thing that I find especially interesting for Kaiser from this perspective is his family background. Both of his parents were artists, an actress and a director. These are the exact types of people that Ego sees as the vanguard of human civilization, creating new forms of expression that leave a lasting impact on the world's standards. But after Kaiser's mother took off and left her heartbroken lover behind, the father abandons his talents and surrenders himself to base pleasures. In other words, this man underwent a tragic descent to the lowest rung of the societal ladder, and he raises his son to view himself as even lesser than that. In short, the story of the Kaiser family is one of cultural and evolutionary regression, culminating in Michael's return to his subhuman status. Also, one other thing that strikes me about Kaiser from this perspective: his conduct towards Ness. As Kaiser continuously rejects his former partner, he starts spelling out explicitly how he views their relationship all along. He was the master, and Ness a pig, puppy, or swine. In other words, his association with or dependence on Kaiser led to Ness's dehumanization, at least from Kaiser's perspective. In Rin's case, these ideas are even more on the nose. He grew up watching Evolman, the perfect marriage of the concepts of evolution and heroism. But instead of rooting for the perfect embodiment of societal progress, Rin relinquishes his claim to humanity and transforms into the ultimate monster, the being that fights to the death to eradicate the next stage in humanity's evolution. And in that light, it's really striking what Isagi identifies as the greatest threat in the lead-up to Rin's goal. Rin has become an incomprehensible monster, a being that defies logic. What truly scares him is that he's no longer facing off against another human, but a denizen of the abyss, from the deepest recesses of the sea. In effect, Rin offers a chilling reminder that there are still vast regions of the earth that humanity has yet to penetrate, let alone control. So, if Ego's theory of evolution paints a narrative of nature giving way to culture, Rin's deep-sea monstrosities represent the indomitable frontiers whose vast trenches render human accomplishments wholly insignificant. It's no coincidence, then, that this resurgence of the primordial order segues directly into the entrance of the absolute beast that is Julien Loki. At this stage, the match threatens to devolve into an animalistic frenzy where might makes right. And so, for BM to turn the tide, they must re-establish order over chaos. And that's where the team's central philosophy comes in. After all, what's the core quality that allowed humanity to establish dominance over the natural world? It's our unprecedented ingenuity, our ability to devise tools and shape the world in our image. And there's no team in the entire NEL that better represents the quintessentially human traits of reason and logic than Bastard München. In fact, the team's ability to tame nature through science was already exemplified by its two first goals in the match. Right when Yoichi Isagi had perfectly positioned himself for a goal, he found himself hunted down by two fearsome predators. But instead of falling prey to their carnivorous instincts, Isagi unveils himself as a shining beacon of humanity's ability to adapt and invent. And that very quality is figurized by his new weapon, the two-gun volley. If PXG scores through ferocious strength and animalistic instincts, BM's first goal is represented by a tool that's far deadlier than even the most terrifying beast. I've already kind of touched on Kaiser's goal using the Magnus effect, but there's an interesting paradox going on here. This new weapon was devised at the height of his delusions, and using it successfully during actual play requires conditions that are virtually impossible to pull off. As such, his first attempt at using this technique is the perfect capstone of his gradual unraveling over the course of the NEL. He's fallen from the epitome of rational football to an erratic liability for his team. But then, Kaiser reconstructs himself from zero, lets go of his unnecessary fixations, and starts to coordinate with the rest of the team, slotting into its underlying logic. This development then gets consolidated through Kaiser's eventual goal, one that celebrates the triumph of reason over base emotions, with his weapon of science that subordinates even the elements to his will. There's actually a small detail that really struck me while rereading Kaiser's backstory. The very first thing Kaiser does when he acquires his football is figure out how it works. When you throw it, it flies away. When it hits a wall, it bounces back. It makes no sound, no matter how hard you beat it. Now, I'm fully aware, of course, that the ball for Kaiser serves as a stand-in for himself. However, that's not how the scene begins. Rather, it shows that his first instinct is to establish the basic laws of physics, as it were. Even in the darkest period of his life, it seems to me that he had this natural inclination towards the sciences, which would later come out in full when he devises his Magnus shot. Now, I've been talking a lot about the progression from an animalistic struggle for survival to full-fledged societies, and how the manga ascribes this transformation to human ingenuity. We've been able to evolve through science, inventions, weaponry, both in real life and figuratively on the pitch. But that still raises the question, where do we go from here? After all, Isagi and Kaiser aren't yet the world's best strikers. However, we can turn to someone in the match who is. It's highly significant that this is the point in the story where we finally discover what makes Noah tick. In the match about evolution, Noah is revealed to be the one whose mindset embodies this concept more strongly than anyone else. He joined the NEL to raise future rivals who will allow him to evolve even further, to become an even stronger life form. And this philosophy finally explains why he reigns supreme as a cyborg, a machine. In the context of a match where science is equated to progress, this perfect embodiment of rationality represents the next stage of humanity's evolution. And with Noah on the field, reason can once again overcome brute force. In Noah's own words, when they come at us with ruthless violence, we'll meet them with cool-headed intelligence. And there's no better demonstration of this principle than when Igarashi, arguably the worst player in the series, repeatedly fouls Blue Lock's number 1 at the peak of his abilities, which happens as soon as Noah enters the field. Facing down against the figurative Goliath, this modern day David comes out supreme through technique and cunning. However, the moment where the team truly comes together in devastatingly rational unity is with Isagi and Kaiser's eventual team-up. Now, I've talked in some of my early videos about how Blue Lock explores social construct theory in the first selection. This idea was laid out most famously by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who claimed that humans were originally part of a brutal state of nature where might makes right, until they eventually banded together and formed societies by entering into contracts with one another. And that's exactly what happens by the end of the PXG match. Bastard München overturns PXG's state of nature when its two leading figures establish a social contract. Chaos makes way for order, nature for culture, instinct for reason. At last, Isagi and Kaiser have found a way to tame the beast. And as I mentioned earlier, they do so by becoming machines for victory in Noah's image, forever evolving towards a higher state of being. Probably my favorite visual indicator for this is the scene where Isagi and Kaiser shake off Rin's Marken. The two pull off this cross run to disrupt Rin's field of vision, but on a symbolic level, their helix-shaped movements closely resemble a strand of DNA, the emblem of evolution. Nevertheless, simply stopping Rin doesn't suffice to fully eclipse PXG. And that's where we finally come full circle in terms of the match's dramatic structure. Right before the start of the match, Ego flagged another concept that's key to securing victory in the NEL, and that's originality. Moreover, Ego equates one's originality to the source of your hunger. And sure enough, the match sees all of its major characters discovering the source of their originality, or more specifically, returning to their point of origin. In the cases of Ness, Kaiser, Rin, and also Jin Kiora, their originality arises from foundational experiences during early childhood. For Kunigami and Isagi, it's represented by a return to their first defining moment in the story. Now, if you think about it, this is the exact opposite trajectory of the evolution paradigm. Blue Lock's brand of evolution is one of eternal change and improvement, most strongly represented by science and reason. Yet, if we look at each of the big origin moments, we get a completely different story. These are like unexpected sparks of magic in the mundane world. Reading a fairy tale for the first time, being captivated by a football in a window display, becoming obsessed with this one character in your favorite show, or even just a moment of realization that you aren't satisfied with your current place in life. There's little rhyme or reason why the sparks flew then and there. And yet, somehow, there appears to be tremendous value in turning back to these origins. Moreover, the way the story equates originality to hunger also associates it with earlier evolutionary stages, in the realm of instinct rather than reason. If we're, for instance, thinking in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food is on the very bottom of the pyramid. So basically, there's this extensive paradox between the two main concepts of the PXG match. Evolution forward can only take place by turning back to your origins. And that's why both ideas come together in the match's finale. When Ness finally accepts that there's no longer anything he can offer Kaiser, he decides to change, to evolve. But in keeping with the ideas of the match, he does so by going back to his original desire. Ness the magician once again resolves to cast a spell over the field. But what's remarkable to me about this scene is that Ness's attempt to return to his origins itself recalls 3 moments of origin from earlier in the arc. One of these is the collision of peak performances between Isagi and Hiyori at the end of the Ubers match, which serves as the origin of Hiyori's life as an egoist. Just look at the similarity in composition between Isagi's two winning goals, both of which came about from a pass to Isagi, who's hidden behind a cluster of defenders. But more than that, both scenes serve as a litmus test of sorts from a passer to a striker, as indicated by a verbal parallel from the respective passer's interior monologue. If he's right there and rewards their trust, they can continue and evolve. It's quite apparent in my view that the conclusion of the NEL was deliberately foreshadowed by the ending of the Ubers match. After all, this goal had Ness ponder whether Isagi's magic is on display during his goal with Hiyori. And then, in the PXG match, we get the exact same scenario, but with the roles in reverse. This time around, Hiyori is the one who declares that Isagi's ability to draw out the ego of others is his true magic, followed by a goal arising from a moment of truth. Secondly, let's have a look at how Ness defines his moment of rebirth. This is his first rebellion against his former master. This is a highly significant phrase because it evokes another first act of rebellion in the series. That being, Kaiser keeping some of the money he stole and using it to buy his football. You know, the moment that serves as the origin of his ego. So, ironically enough, Ness is actually being exactly like Kaiser when he declares war against him. And if we're talking about Ness's evolution in light of Kaiser's earlier awakening, there's another visual parallel to consider. When the figure that Ness took out for Kaiser turns out to have been Isagi all along, this confusion of identities is reinforced by the similarity in composition with the spread of Kaiser returning to 0 earlier in the match. So with that, we've come to the decisive difference between Isagi and Kaiser. In the very end, Kaiser failed to acknowledge that Ness could ever change, even though he was the one best positioned to recognize the significance of Ness's rebellion. Moreover, note how Kaiser's own rationalization for his failure ties in to the ongoing ideas about nature versus culture. Kaiser could only see Ness as a pig, a remnant of the lower stages of the evolutionary hierarchy. Yet it was actually Kaiser who failed to fully realize his human potential all along. He succumbed to pleasure like the beasts of PXG, and gave in to his emotions when assessing Ness's potential. And in doing so, he failed to reach the next stage in his evolution, to become a goal-scoring machine. And on the other side, Isagi gambled on the possibility that Ness would surpass everyone's expectations, and he did so by embodying, or even surpassing, Kaiser in his purest form. Moreover, this is the scene that best of all brings together the two central concepts of the match. We've got two players who return to their origins and use this as a springboard to reach the next step, and this is symbolized by the confluence of their two brands of magic. And with that, Isagi stands tall as the champion of the NEL, by looking back as the starting point for his ultimate evolution. That's all from my end. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. And there's a few people I do also want to thank a bit more. Firstly, Gabriel Lewis for his invaluable help with editing this video. And then of course I'm going to my €10 patrons, who are the ones who are really supporting the channel more than anyone else. Jesus Cujo, Patrician Pat, Orangey Legend, and Trishula the Best Boy. If I'm evolving at any point of the process, they're definitely part of the influence on that. And until next time, Slán go fóill.